You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the United States.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you are listening to your favorite international podcast.
We're back.
Yes.
Sorry
about last week. We had some technical difficulties with our recording, and there was just no way of fixing it on time. But we're back, and you are here, and we are here, and thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Murder, Mystery, and the Macabre. And we are beyond grateful that you stick with us through all of this.
Oh, we have the best listeners that we could ever hope for. Yeah. I also want to just make a really quick note while we're on the topic of audio difficulty that I am now living next door to a construction site. I'm going to have some new neighbors. They're building a new house. They seem like super awesome people, but sporadically very loud over here. So fingers and toes crossed that my very, very fancy phone box is going to do the trick here. But if you hear any kind of banging or booming in the background, it's the construction site I'm living next to. Also, it's very windy today. So as we said, yeah, we do have the absolute best listeners. And of course, as always, we want to give a very special shout out to our newest Patreon members who really do help to keep this all going. And they are Michelle Halverson, thank you. Big thank you to Rory Jensen. Thanks to Veronica. Thank you to Violetta. That's another beautiful name. Also to Dee, Susan, and Amanda. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We are already working on our next Down the Rabbit Hole, so stay tuned for that one. Also, game night is coming up end of the month. We're going to announce the date in the next couple of days, I think.
Yeah, I found this funny article the other day too that was just awful. As I was reading it, I was like, this is terrible, and I wanted to read it out loud to Paul so he could experience it with me, but instead I'm going to save it for Patreon.
Without further ado, let's get into today's episode because Annie has something for us, right?
I do. So today I am going to be talking about murder and mystery that took place in and around the area of Bucksport, Maine. So local New Englanders, most definitely Downeasters, probably immediately have at least one of my mysteries in mind when I've said Bucksport. And today I might be ruining one mystery, but hopefully I'll give you at least one or two more to sort of think about for a little while.
I'm very intrigued. Are there any content warnings?
I don't think so. There's some macabre history, a haunting, spooky cemetery stuff, and an unavenged murder. Oh, the murder details are they're a bit gruesome, particularly when the body is found. So when we get to that point, maybe don't eat lunch if you're not dead inside like I am.
I know. I once ate porridge while watching Human Centipede 2.
Nice.
Porridge was good though. All right, I'm all here for your story.
All right. Oh, also,
let's get into it.
I need to warn you that my Botox for migraine has completely worn off. My next round of shots is next week, and we've had a lot of crazy weather, so I have been literally surviving the last few days on indica cannabis edibles. They are kind of the only thing that dulls the migraine pain enough and also helps that associated nausea. I don't think I'd be recording today if I didn't have them. But you've also got an elevated Annie today. I've just been taking low-dose gummies all day. I'm sure one will kick in halfway through this episode. But yeah, all right, here we go. So let's start by talking a little bit about the great state of Maine. Maine is the northernmost and easternmost state in the United States. It's part of New England, of course, and the New England states are Massachusetts, my state, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. New York is not part of New England. But Maine is bigger than the rest of those other 5 states combined. Despite its large size, it's one of the least populated states in the country, actually, not just in New England. The most populous area in Maine is Portland, which is a great city, and that is located near the Piscataqua River that I mispronounced horrifically in episode 1. The state insect of Maine is technically the honeybee, but I feel very strongly that most Mainers would agree the state insect is actually the mosquito or black fly, depending on where you are and what time of year it is. Am I wrong, Maine? Tell me. So the Atlantic Ocean's Gulf of Maine is to the south and east of the state, and to the west is the state of New Hampshire. It is the only state in the contiguous United States that only borders one other state. If you keep going north, you're going to hit Canada. Maine also has the most French speakers in North America outside of Canada's Quebec province. That fact was kind of a surprise to me. If you had asked me what state had the most French speakers in North America outside of Quebec, I would have guessed Louisiana.
Oh, that is interesting. All your things are interesting, not just this one, but I find it is really interesting. I would have guessed Louisiana as well.
I know. It's funny because I'm from this area and I've been to Maine many times, and I kept finding these fun little facts. So, of course, I'm sharing them all with you. So Maine has almost 230 miles, which is 400 kilometers of ocean coastline, and 3,500 miles, or 5,600 kilometers of tidal coastline, which is more than California has. I think it's only like Alaska and Florida that have more coastline than Maine. Maine's coastline has so many deep harbors. I thought this was fascinating. You could provide anchorage for all of the naval fleets in the entire world along the coast of Maine. Like,
wow.
That seemed right.
That is impressive.
Yeah. And, now the fun stuff. So the foods that Maine is most known for are blueberries. Maine blueberries are the best blueberries. And, of course, fish and shellfish, but especially lobster. Now, there are 2 different kinds of lobster rolls, so when you're visiting, you'll be able to tell the difference between the 2 and see which one you prefer. If your lobster roll has cold lobster mixed with seasoning and mayonnaise, that's a Maine-style lobster roll. And my mother would say it's the superior of the rolls. But you'll also find lobster served with hot butter on sort of warmer lobster on a toasted bun. And that's also, I've heard, very nice. But lobster and blueberries are the 2 big ones. Most of the country's blueberries and lobsters come from Maine. And Maine lobster is very different from lobster in the rest of the world. And I should say it's different, not better, but anyone who's ordered lobster and got one of those like small, spiny Caribbean lobsters, Maine lobster is better. It's fine. I can say that. Maine also has really good agriculture, primarily hay and potatoes, but its biggest industry was shipbuilding. The first ship in the Americas, built by English colonists, was launched on the Kennebec River in 1607. I didn't look up the pronunciation of Kennebec. I really hope that's correct. Rivers are Today, Maine is home to many of the best boat builders in the world. And the first naval battle of the Revolutionary War was fought off the coast of Maine in 1775. Acadia National Park, which is beautiful, is the only national park in New England. And Maine is the state in the contiguous United States, so of course that means not including Alaska or Hawaii, with the most moose.
Or I like to call them meese.
Meese.
Or mooses, depending on my mood.
Moose.
Or moodus.
I like mooses. This was also something I must have learned this at some point, but just forgotten, that originally Maine was part of the Massachusetts colony, like that territory was part of Massachusetts. And formal succession from Massachusetts and admission to statehood was March 15th, 1820. So the anniversary of Maine's statehood is this week. Congratulations, Maine. Happy anniversary. They were the 23rd state. All right, so there are some fun facts about the great state of Maine that may someday show up on Jeopardy or in your local pub quiz. So, we just talked about how the state of Maine used to be a territory that belonged to Massachusetts, and in 1762, Colonel Jonathan Buck and some others who had received land grants, they arrived in Maine to survey the land before returning home to Haverhill, Massachusetts. In June 1763, Jonathan Buck returned to Maine to settle permanently what was then known as Plantation Number 1. So, the term plantation in this circumstance is not the same as our antebellum southern plantations that probably most people come to think about with enslaved people ensuring profits, right? That's, I think, probably what most people think of when you hear the term plantation. Yeah. But I'm not suggesting that Maine had no connection to the slave trade. Those ships they built were used often enough to kidnap and transport people and sell them into slavery, but there's no slavery involved in this case, and in this case, a plantation has nothing to do with slavery. It just means a sort of a new, unincorporated town. That is a gross oversimplification of a lot of heavy topics, but I hope that makes sense. Okay. So, in 1762, Buck sailed up the Penobscot River, and he surveyed 6 different plantations, which are now today towns like Bucksport, Surrey, Blue Hill, etc. Plantation number 1 would become Bucksport, and the first thing that Jonathan Buck did was to build a sawmill. The sawmill was completed in 1764, and according to the historical marker where the sawmill once stood, it, quote, provided boards, shingles, and clapboards needed for settlers and also shipped them to Boston and more distant ports. The mill was powered by water flowing through Mill Stream, including 3 dams that were constructed and extended from the mill to Mill Pond, or Silver Lake as it is called today. The mill quickly became surrounded with new development that included numerous homes, barns, a tannery, a trading house, a smokehouse for fish, and a blacksmith shop. In 1770 to 1771, the 60-ton schooner Hannah was built, the first of many vessels to be built in Bucksport shipyards using wood from the mill, end quote. And it should be noted that this particular marker was donated by the Bucksport High School class of 1953. We will be circling back to Silver Lake later on. So, the new town of Bucksport, or wasn't yet known that really at the time, but the area where would become Bucksport, would be pretty much destroyed by British forces during the Revolutionary War, but it would be rebuilt. According to Wikipedia, quote, on April 14, 1779, the stronghold became the site of a major American naval defeat called the Penobscot Expedition. The following day, when most of Plantation No. 1 was deserted, the 16-gun Royal Navy sloop HMS Nautilus anchored at the harbor. Its crew burned the town, sparing only those remaining inhabitants who swore allegiance to the crown. But following the peace treaty of 1783, the town was resettled and called Buckstown Plantation after its founder. Incorporated on June 27, 1792 as Buckstown, it was renamed Bucksport in 1817. End quote. So that's your history of Bucksport. And if you're a fan of the show Dark Shadows, the fictional Collinsport is based on Bucksport. I think probably on account of all the spooky fuckery going on in this very small Maine town. And speaking of spooky fuckery, it's time for legend number 1. Are you ready? It's pretty exciting.
So ready.
Colonel Jonathan Buck, town founder, was Justice of the Peace for the town of Bucksport. Therefore, it fell onto him to sentence a local woman who had been tried and convicted as a witch to be burned at the stake, on account of all her witchiness. I mean, it's got to be done. Can't not burn them, right? So, a pyre was built, and the witch was tied to it. And I think I mentioned earlier that hay is a bumper crop in Maine, so that was super useful for getting that fire started.
I'm sorry that I'm laughing.
No, I intended it to kind of be funny. Sorry. And as the fire was lit, the witch screamed out a final curse, cursing Jonathan Buck and the town of Bucksport forever. And it was really awful because once she caught fire, she started screaming things like, "I'll dance on your grave." But then her leg, it fell off and it rolled down the pyre toward a crowd of people who had come to watch her burn on account of it being the 1700s in Maine.
I mean, what else was there to do, right?
Literally nothing. Nothing. Of course you're going to go watch the witch burn. It's a cautionary tale for the children.
Imagine you're missing the one thing that's going to happen all year.
Yeah, the witch burning.
The witch burning.
That's what would happen to me. I'd miss it. I'd be like, wow, it was great. Real quiet in the fields today. And then you'd find out, The crowd that had gathered for good old-fashioned burning turned out to be horrified when her charred leg just fell off her body and then rolled down the pyre toward the assembled looky-loos because,
I mean,
it's more reality than anybody wants, isn't it? You want to see the witch burn, but you don't want to get touched by the burning witch. It's too much, isn't it? And so, when Jonathan Buck died in March of 1795, his family erected a huge memorial marker, as was befitting the man who founded the town, and before long they were shocked to see the clear outline of a foot on Buck's grave. And thrice the family have replaced that stone, and thrice the foot keeps on reappearing. That witch is making good on her curse and dancing on his grave. And tourists come from all over to see the cursed gravestone. I sent you a picture of it. There's also a heart on the marker, but it's like a big, pedestal with like a tall obelisk that goes up, and way up higher there's a mark that looks like a heart, but it's sideways. And apparently that's there because the witch was a woman that he was also having an affair with. It was a secret affair. I know. Nobody saw that coming. And they produced a son, and then he needed to get rid of her. But yeah, we'll post pictures of the marker, and clear as day, there's the foot, and further on up, there's the heart. I mean, to be fair, it looks like a leg and a foot, I think, in the same way that Italy looks like a boot, right? It's pareidolia. It's seeing the shapes of recognizable things because our brain wants to recognize things.
Yeah, of course, it's the same phenomena that causes people to see faces in, mirrors, reflection, dirty windows in haunting photographs, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Brains are weird, aren't they? I think I'd just prefer myself personally to look at glass and think, wow, that needs reglazing, rather than looking at something and being like, is it just me, or is that the ghost of a Victorian child trapped in this mirror? Is her throat cut? Where's her arm? It's always this very dramatic stuff, and it's somehow managed to fuel countless cable television shows. It's good stuff.
I also wonder how common it was that a person would just, lose a limb while being burned on the stake. That's a serious question I never thought about. I don't think that happened too often. I don't know. How weird is it that a leg is rolling around? Shape-wise, you would think that it's more of a sliding movement and that it would get caught on something pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Also, did the family actually have to replace the gravestone really 3 times? That's pricey.
Right.
That's really pricey.
So I have answers for you on both of those accounts. The first isn't so much of an answer as I've been kind of laughing to myself every night when a log sort of rolls off the fire. I now think of that leg. I don't think this actually happened, obviously. So as for replacing the gravestone, if you're familiar with this legend and you love this legend and you want to keep believing this legend, maybe go ahead and skip ahead a minute or two because this is what really happened. So first of all, it's not his gravestone. He has a regular, normal little gravestone that matches all the other little gravestones in the cemetery at the family plot. What we're talking about is a monument that is this large obelisk that was dedicated to him, and I think it was done by maybe his grandchildren even. I don't think it was his children. I think it was a further on descendant. But according to one of his current descendants, what happened was when they had this monument built, the slab of granite that was used on this one side, and it's right by the Buck name, you'll see it, there was just a crack in it, just a really fine hairline crack running through this big slab of granite, and that is super common. Over the years, dust and dirt and pollen and all the other crap floating around in the air sort of gets into that crack and then combines with moisture and really settles into those lines and oxidizes. And so that's why you can see it very clearly, and more clearly in some pictures than others. The family did not replace the stone. If they did, the crack would be gone and the image would be gone. What the family has done, which makes so much more sense, is, according to the descendant, they've had it cleaned. They've had it sanded down, cleaned. Then, of course, over time, the pollen and dust builds up again and the shape reappears. So I'm assuming it's the same for that heart on the taller portion. There's a sideways heart. And no, the family has never actually replaced the entire monument, not even once, nevertheless, over and over again. They've just had it cleaned. It should also be noted that there was never a witch burned in Maine. And witches in the colonies, and of course, yeah, I'm talking about the Salem witch trials, which had already happened. That was more than 100 years before Buck passed away. And those witches were hanged, or in some cases pressed, but not burned. Burning was sort of your side of the pond, wasn't it? That's a European...
Yeah.
Mostly.
That's us.
Mostly, yeah. Also, as Justice of the Peace, that would not have been his job anyhow. Like, Justice of the Peace wasn't going around sentencing people to burn. Jonathan Buck had a remarkable life. He was married, had children who would go on to prosper, but there's just no evidence of any kind of witch or affair or illegitimate child, as some of the legends say. One version even says that he and the witch had a child who was a sort of Quasimodo sort of character, and that when the leg...
Of course.
Yeah, when the leg rolled off the bonfire, he's like, "Martha!" And he, like, grabs it and takes off and runs into the woods with it. It's fun. I mean, it's fun when you know that there's no truth to any of it. If you're from the area, you probably have your own version of the witch on the grave of Colonel Buck. So please do let us know about it. I'd love to hear about it. And that was me ruining the first fun legend in the area. But now I do have the true story of a murder that took place in Bucksport, and it's one where I think everyone knows who did it, but there was just never any justice. And that's how you get ghosts, isn't it? Am I wrong?
Yeah, pretty much a guaranteed ghost right there.
I think so. All right.
All they want is vengeance.
I love the way you say vengeance. All right. Sarah MacDonald was born in 1846 in Nova Scotia, and we don't know a lot about her life, really. We know she moved to Maine and married Charles W. Ware. The Ware family were prominent local undertakers. Sarah and Charles would have 3 children together. Edwin was born in 1870, Alice was born in 1872, and Mildred was born in 1874. All 3 of the children were born in Maine. Their middle daughter, Alice, sadly died of natural causes, is what it says on the death certificate. So I'm assuming it was some kind of illness at the time, because she was only 18 years old. That was 1890. Another misfortune to befall the family was that Sarah and Charles would divorce. It's hard to find a lot of specific information, but obviously this was not common in the 1800s. But it does seem that she stayed in Bucksport and Charles went to Boston. And, I mean, it's no surprise, right, that it reflected more poorly on the woman than the man? So there was a lot of rumor and gossip about her, but she was a kind woman, a hardworking woman, and in order to provide for herself, Sarah would take all manner of odd jobs. Primarily, she worked as a housekeeper and she would care for other people's children, that sort of thing. In the fall of 1898, Sarah is living with Mrs. Elmira Miles, who is a widow in her 50s to 80s, depending on the source you read. It's kind of hard. Most sources indicate that she's in her 80s, but I'm really not sure how old Mrs. Miles was. My understanding is I think Sarah helped with housekeeping, and I do think that's because Mrs. Miles was getting on in age, but in return for the work she did around the house, she had a bedroom and lived with Mrs. Miles. In 1893, her ex-husband Charles died in Boston of emphysema at the age of 45. His body was returned to Bucksport, and he was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. His death certificate still says he's married. I've got a copy of it, which does make me wonder whether they actually divorced or just sort of decided to go their own way.
I mean, divorce separation is not very uncommon after losing a child, but I also think that back then, official divorces were probably not that common, and that it was rather people just moving out of the house and, moving on with their lives. I mean, we have seen cases where people were married again while never being officially divorced. Way simpler back then, too. Like, also way simpler to take on a new identity.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So on September 17th, 1898, it's kind of a foggy evening, and Sarah is 52 years old, and she sets out after dinner to run some errands in town. She needs to make a small purchase at the local shop, and she wants to visit her various employers to collect her wages for the previous week or month or however her system works. When she doesn't return, Mrs. Miles isn't initially worried because Sarah does all kinds of odd jobs, and it would not be uncommon for her to be asked to stay and help with a meal, or, hey, could you please stay for a couple of days and help because, the mother of the children is under the weather, that kind of thing, right? So at first, Mrs. Miles is really not overly concerned, but after a few days, she begins to mention her concern to more people around the town. But the town doesn't have detectives, and those in charge of the town don't really want to hear the negative rumors and speculation. Was she set upon by criminals near the railroad tracks? That kind of thing, right? There were a lot of people who had something to gain from making sure they had a safe, prosperous town where a woman could walk around at night unmolested. And so there was some feeling that people intentionally didn't look very hard to find her. But that did not stop the locals who knew her and cared about her from searching for her.
Was it also that they didn't look too hard because she was a divorced woman?
I suspect that was probably part of it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of speculation about, was she having an affair with so-and-so? Was she, I think also because she was divorced. And also probably because it's all people had time for. I can't imagine how gossipy small towns must have been before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we know that night she had gone to the Foggs. Their last name is with 2 G's, and they owned a small shop, and she had gone in there and purchased 2 cigarillos, or little cigars, for herself. And then it's kind of hard to figure out exactly where she went because she visited a few different people, and we all know that witness testimony is terrible, right? Eyewitness testimony is awful. And when you talk to different people, they all thought they saw her at different times and places, which they did. Chief amongst the possibilities was a visit to William T. Trewergy. William was a 40-year-old widower who owned a shop. He was like a tin peddler and sold various things. He had 2 daughters, and Sarah had been a live-in housekeeper and nanny to his girls for some time. And I did read in one account that he'd been married again, but his second wife left him. I'm not sure if that's true, but he is uniformly described as, not that nice a guy. He was also described in some papers as a, quote, religious enthusiast, end quote. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Because normally you see somebody, and they'll say, they were devoutly religious. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or they were
a religious enthusiast is
he was a
weird.
religious enthusiast.
I'm just trying to figure out what they meant, because, we always come across this kind of sources and old articles, and you get kind of interested in deciphering the code they use, in a way. Religious enthusiast.
He didn't care what religion. He just wanted to make sure you had one.
Maybe some kind of obscure fringe group religion?
Could be. I think the more important thing, though, is he was locally known to be kind of an asshole. Not the finest kind, as they would say in Maine. He was just not a nice guy. He was short-tempered and could be violent and just...
He was an asshole.
Yeah, total asshole. We also know that night that she needed to visit a man by the name of... I think the name is pronounced Bolduc. Boulduc. Bolduc. John Bolduc, who was another neighbor and customer that she had helped to keep house for in the past. Mrs. Miles actually thought that maybe she had been held up doing some last-minute work for Mr. Bolduc. And in fact, the day after Sarah went missing, Mrs. Miles asked Mr. Trewergy, who had visited with her after church, to have supper. So she asked him during the meal, would he please check in with Mr. Bolduc and see if Sarah was maybe staying there to do some work so that she could quit worrying. He didn't report back until a few days later that he hadn't seen Mr. Bolduc, so he was no help. Unfortunately, on Sunday, October 2nd, a search party was finally able to find Sarah, and sadly, they used the smell of her decomposing body to locate her. She was lying on her back in a field not far from where she lived with Mrs. Miles. In fact, her body was found pretty close to where the high school parking lot is today. So, if you're a member of high school there. Sarah's hands were crossed over her chest. Some of the buttons at her waist and corset were open. She was known to tuck money into her undergarments, and at the time they thought maybe whoever killed her was looking for money, as opposed to it pointing to a sort of sexual assault of any kind. There was no evidence of that, but they did find $1 tucked into her corset. Her dress was up to her knees, and they could tell that she had suffered serious head injury. the left side of her head was kind of crushed, and there were also crushing injuries on her forehead. And there was an advanced state of decomposition. She was identifiable only by her clothing. Her head was resting on what seems to be described as an old raincoat that had been sort of folded up and acting as a pillow. But when she went out that evening, she was wearing a short cape. No one knows if the raincoat was hers or not, and if it was, how was it taken from the house after the fact. Also, her hat that she was wearing that night was crushed beneath her, and her bag was found nearby. That hadn't been stolen.
I find it very interesting that the head was resting on a makeshift pillow. I think that these kind of things always tell a lot about.
Yeah, I agree.
Who placed her there?
I find that
I don't know
interesting.
If who murdered her or who placed her there. No, it's this kind of taking care of the person, of the body.
Yep. I know exactly what you mean. And unfortunately, we don't. Well, you'll find out. Okay. So, at the scene were many of the townspeople, including her brother-in-law, George Ware, who was the local undertaker, and Mr. Trowergy. And so these two went over to the body to lift it up from the ground and place it into the box so that it could be removed from the scene and taken to the funeral home in preparation for autopsy. And when they lifted her off the ground, her head fell off.
Oof.
Yeah. It's kind of a tough crime scene. A serrated knife was also found near the body, as was, I think I mentioned, her bag. It's unclear to me how many scanned articles. I read so many articles on this, and I don't know if her throat was actually cut or if it was just advanced decay that caused the separation of her head from her body. But either way, that and the advanced insect activity would have been a tough one to deal with. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head, which is why I'm saying I don't know whether her throat was cut. And I don't think there was a tremendous amount of blood. So if her throat was cut, I think it would have been done post-mortem. But there was no police force with seasoned detectives. You know what I mean? Nobody had any kind of, we have more forensic knowledge than these people do, right? And so you had to hire detectives. But not everybody wanted that. There were people, like I said, higher-ups in town who just didn't want any bad publicity. And so they're trying to float ideas like, it was a very foggy night. I bet she just tripped in the fog, hit her head, died of exposure, and then all that crushing damage to her head, that was probably just a herd of cows walked over her face after she died. You know, they're just coming up with crazy. Sure, those are hoof marks, right? But
they just want to explain it away.
Yeah, exactly. Locals had other theories. They wondered if the divorcee was having an affair with one of the town's many widowers, including Mr. Baldock or Mr. Trowergy. Had that gotten her killed? Had someone robbed her? Or had someone lost their temper when she asked them for her wages? Had an immigrant railroad worker found her? Ugh, the horror. And so eventually detectives were brought in, one from Lewiston and one from Bangor. And the detectives arrive with their magnifying glasses and they go to set. I have no idea if they had them, but what else are they going to have, right? They're bloodhounds. They get out of their carriage with their enormous bloodhound and their magnifying glass. And so
pipes.
That's right, the nice hat. So Mrs. Miles had told them that her money was kept in the trunk in her room, and so they went into her room and they went to search through all of Sarah's possessions. They're trying to see if the money had been stolen. Maybe that was the motive for her murder. And they believed she had somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 saved up, but it wasn't found in the trunk. The trunk was empty of money. And so they went and inquired at the local bank, and they found out no, she had no account there either. So where was that money? It is interesting to note that there was a second search later on, and wouldn't you know it, they found the money.
So didn't they search properly, you think, or did somebody put it back in?
I suspect somebody put it back, is my guess. Frederick Odlin, who was the detective from Lewiston, then found a few problematic things when visiting Mr. Trowergy at his shop. So he found a big piece of canvas that was around 10 feet by 12 feet, like a square around, so like 3 by 3 meters, just like a big canvas tarp, right? And when he was examining this tarp, it appeared to be blood-stained. He also found a hammer with a wooden handle that had WTT, which were William T. Trewergy's initials. They had been carved into the handle, and that hammer was completely covered in blood. And this is what the Bangor Daily News had to say about it. So this is 21st July, 1902, page 1. And this is just a segment about the hammer from a larger article. Quote, "It was an ordinary, lightweight carpenter's claw hammer with oval face and wooden handle, such a hammer as would be used in finishing work. Was stain on face of hammer. Appeared to be bloodstains. Hammer was found under cushion in piano box buggy in stable at rear of Trewergy's store." End quote. So that was found on November 12th. But after they found this potentially very damning information, they were like, listen, we think, the smoking gun, but here's the thing. We're out of money, and so we're going to go. Take care. Bye-bye. And they left. They just left. And that was kind of it. The people in town had to then raise another $500 in order to pay the detectives to come back and keep searching. But that took several months to do. But finally, they got a break when early spring the next year, a man in town confessed to helping Trewergy move Sarah's body to the location where it was found. So this is the best quote I've found about this whole confession, and this is from the Boston Globe. It's an article by J.N. Taylor, and I'm kind of taking it apart and reading it out of sync, but in a way that makes sense to the way I'm telling the story. Hopefully that makes sense. You're going to hear me mention a jigger. Jigger. That's the term my parents always used for a shot, a measurement of liquor. But it's also a type of wagon where the base is like low to the ground and it doesn't necessarily have any sides. Like, you know, those giant pallet moving shopping carts you can get at like DIY building stores or home lumber stores. They're huge, but with 4 sturdy wheels and it's pulled by a horse. Do you know what I mean? But low to the ground. Okay, here is Fogg's confession. Quote, "Fogg told me the story of the aid he gave to Trewergy in removing the body. Good guessers would likely name his age as not far from 30. He is above the medium in height, rather slender, tells a straightaway story, and would impress a listener as being truthful. At the time of the killing of Sarah Ware, Fogg was employed on a vessel and did not return until 4 or 5 days after her disappearance. Quote, I am not a man of much learning, he said, as a preface to the story of aiding Trewergy, but I do know how to tell a straight story of what I see and do. I met him sometime between September 23rd, 1898, and the Sunday following. He asked me if I didn't want to go along with him to help do a job he had in mind, and as it was my business to pick up what I could in doing odd jobs, I said yes. He had a horse and a light jigger, and we drove out to the Miles house. As we turned up the lane to the house, he said, quote, I am going to move a body, and if ever you say anything about it, you'll go the same way. When he pulled up to a stop, he said, you stand by the horse, and then he took a piece of canvas from the jigger and went over the wall. Pretty soon he appeared, dragging something in the canvas, and when he reached the jigger, I helped him put it aboard. Then we drove farther up the lane and stopped beside an old fence. I helped him take the body off the jigger, and he pulled the canvas from under it. The exact place where we left it was the exact spot where the body of Sarah Ware was found. We drove back to the village again, and on the way Trewergy again told me that if I ever said a word about it, I'd go the same way. When we reached the village, I left the jigger and started on the run for home. I was never so frightened in my life. It seemed as if a ghost was after me. I could not get into the house quick enough. The day before the Orland Fair, which was during the time Sarah was missing, I told my wife and mother of having helped to move a body. I also told the same story to Joe Auttack the day of the fair, and the Sunday the body was found, I told Coroner Davis I would bet that was the body I helped Trewergy to move. End quote.
So he told a lot of people.
He did.
He didn't stay quiet.
Yeah.
But the good thing is now they've got him. They got the murderer.
Right. You would think so. Right? And with this admission, the detectives do arrest Trewergy. So in March of 1899, so 123 years ago this week, actually, they arrested Trewergy. Unfortunately, I think it was 5 days, it was less than a week after Trewergy's arrest, Fogg recanted his story of helping Trewergy to move the body. He takes it all back, he says he was lying, and Trewergy is released, and Fogg is arrested and put in prison for perjury. Fogg was in prison for about a month, and then the grand jury met and there was no indictment, so everything was dropped and he was released from prison. And a lot of the higher-ups in town were very pleased that the matter had been dropped. It was an ugly affair. They didn't want to deal with it.
So Fogg just recanted out of the blue?
Mm-hmm.
Do we know if he got pressured or, that was it?
Yeah.
That was...
Mm-hmm. For a few years, yeah, that was it. And then some new politicians were elected, and in the fall of 1901, the case was re-examined by people who did feel like everything had been pushed aside too easily before, right? Because obviously a lot of people were like, hang on a minute, no one's paying for this crime. So Trewergy was again arrested, and the investigator speaks to Fogg, and he does believe his story of being intimidated. Then what happens is while they're talking to Fogg, he then recants his previous recantation, like he takes back the take back. And he says, no, the original story was true, absolutely true. He helped Trewergy just as he said, and the only reason he recanted was because Trewergy, and I think he also said other people in town, had threatened his life if he spoke about it. So Trewergy is rearrested. But he's released on bail, and then it takes 3 years. So it isn't until 1902 that Trewergy is going to go to trial, potentially, for this murder. And this is from the Boston Globe, 13 July 1902 by J.N. Taylor. This is the article that I took Fogg's confession out of, and this is the rest of that story. So Taylor is recounting the confession from Fogg, and then he says, quote, "Of course, I said, you must understand that when a man tells a story under oath and then swears that what he said was a lie, he is likely to be doubted ever after. I understand all that," he replied, "but my first statement was the truth just the same, and I was frightened into taking it back by men in town who made me believe that I'd go the same way as Sarah Ware if I didn't. I was scared half to death. Are you not afraid now that those who threatened you will interfere again?" "No, sir, I am not. I was scared by Trewergy himself into helping him move that body, and then when I told of what had taken place, I was frightened into branding myself a liar. What I said and what I say now regarding Trewergy and the body removed is true." The article goes on to recap Fogg's statement, as I read to you previously, and it goes on to mention that Joseph Fogg Sr. And his wife, Joe's mother, will be testifying, and then they list some other witnesses who also heard Fogg confess to helping Trewergy move the body before they found the body. I think it's also important to mention here that Fogg was Fogg Jr. He was 27, and he could write his name, but nothing else. He could not read. Some of the reports that you read paint him as being maybe a little bit intellectually challenged. I mention that because the word most often used in papers of the day is a half-wit, right? I mean, we never use that term today.
So he was probably taken advantage of.
Exactly.
By, first of all, he's the person in town who does the odd jobs, who needs the money.
Yep.
And nobody will believe him if he says something because he's considered to be a quote-unquote half-wit.
Exactly. And also, in his defense as well, he had no reason to think that Trewergy would ever murder anybody. And
of course,
it would be super common for people to run into him and say, "Hey, can you help me out with this job? I'll pay you to help me." That happens all the time. I was one of those people for years after college. I babysat. I pet sat. I did all that kind of stuff. If you needed somebody, I needed the money. So it's not uncommon, right? You just feel so bad for Fogg because he really did get screwed over. The problem is he's all the evidence they have in the 3 or so years since they first arrested Trewergy and then brought him to trial. So he was not imprisoned during this time. He had been home. But during this time, the bloody hammer went missing. The tarp with the canvas with the blood on it went missing. Investigators and the coroner that performed the autopsy, they had either died or moved away. And because he had recanted under duress, even though it was under duress, it was that still, people don't believe you as much because you say one thing and then another. And so in 1902, William Trewergy was acquitted of the murder of Sarah Ware, and the case is still open today. Most people believe that Trevor G was guilty. He had access to Mrs. Miles's home, so I think he had maybe roomed with her before, but he was a close neighbor and frequent guest. So, like we were saying before, with that money sort of disappearing, or did he go and get the raincoat and bring it back to the body? Do you know what I mean? Because he had access. He could easily get in and out of her house and her rooms.
Do we know a motive, or do people... I mean, was it the money?
Yeah.
But then again, the money was returned later on.
Yeah,
so.
People think probably he just lost his temper when she went to try to collect the money that he owed her, because I think he was just he was just awful and violent. He'd also been heard over saying that he knew more about the case than these investigators did. You know, those type, I know more about this than anybody does. Well,
bragging.
Maybe he did. He was also notably one of the only people who didn't actually help search. Like, he never joined in any of the searches, but miraculously showed up just in time to help move the body. That's weird, right? Because, like, either you don't care, in which case you're not showing up for anything.
Yeah.
Or you know she's dead, so you're not going to waste your time searching. Emmerich Spooner is the man who I would say is the foremost expert on this crime. And he's a librarian in Bucksport who has written, I believe, 2 books on this subject now. And he believes that Trevor G was guilty. If he believes it, I believe it. He has also mentioned that another variation on the myth of Buck's tomb, you know, with the witch dancing on the grave, was that there's a version that says the woman John Buck had the affair with was not a witch, but murder victim Sarah Ware. She gets roped back into that one. So now if someone tells you all about the infamously cursed Buck monument and his affair with a murder victim, you can set them straight.
Oh, I love these kind of stories that over time lore interweaves with each other, even though it doesn't make any sense time-wise, but I love it.
I know.
When that link back one to another.
It's the best. It's the best. But wait, there's more. So Sarah's skull had been cleaned. It was kept as evidence, the skull, because it had marks on it that were consistent with Trevor G's hammer. And so her ex-brother-in-law, the undertaker, he had cleaned the skull, and it had been preserved as evidence for the trial. In the meantime, her body had been buried in a pauper's grave, so that would have meant at the time that it would have the very simplest of wooden markers, right? Not any kind of elaborate headstone. There were also reports that her daughter Mildred moved her mother's body so that she could have some rest and not be bothered by people like us who were interested in all the details of the case, but who, unlike us, were not respectful of the victims and their families. Because there's a difference, isn't there? It's like the difference between people who go and leave a flower at the scene of a tragedy versus the people who steal raisins off cakes and carve slivers of bloody wood, right, off a building as keepsakes. Y'all know what I mean.
I'm still not over the stolen raisins.
The audacity. My God. Yeah. So, here's where things get a little bit problematic. In the 1930s, a dam was built which would make it was like Mill Pond would then become Silver Lake or expand Silver Lake. And so all of the graves in Silver Lake Cemetery had to be relocated to Oak Hill Cemetery because that whole area was going to be flooded when this dam was built. The problem is, was Sarah's and some of the other pauper graves ever actually moved? Or just the bodies that had stone headstones? Because even if they had intended to move all of the bones, how would they find an old pauper's grave where the wood would have rotted away to nothing after 2 Maine winters, right? Like, I don't think they moved her body. At least I think that's the best explanation that the hikers and fishermen have when they see the ghost of a headless woman when conditions are just right and the fog is hanging over Silver Lake. Yeah, there are lots of reports of a headless woman standing in the fog.
Spooky fuckery.
In 1998, so over 100 years after the murder, Sarah's skull was discovered as evidence in the courthouse in Ellsworth. Her head was buried next to her ex-husband in Oak Hill Cemetery, but we still to this day don't know if her body was ever moved there or if she is under Silver Lake just waiting to say hello the next time you're on an early morning hike. And that is it. That is Bucksport, Maine, and the curse of Colonel Jonathan Buck and the murder of Sarah Ware. That's the end.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I never heard any of it. I definitely learned a lot, especially about Maine, which is always good.
Right? I love Maine. I have to do a quick shout out because one of my best friends and her kiddos, who are like a niece and nephew to me, Dara, Jack, and Stella, I miss you all. Dara was my roommate my first year at university down in Florida, and I had come from Cape Cod, like coastal Massachusetts, and she was from coastal Maine, and I'm not sure we would have survived that year without each other. I love visiting her family in Maine. If you ever have a chance to get up to Acadia National Park, it is gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Yeah. All right, something good.
My something good is my husband was here for 10 days because it was my birthday and he took vacation and came home. And the messages, well, the post you made, I really loved that when you said people should post a picture or a gif of something they associate with me. And it really made it really was so sweet of all the
Such
things
good
people
answers.
think of when they think of me. It's a lot of Beach Boys and Keanu Reeves and Beagles. But yeah, it was a great birthday. It was so cute, and I got a really great present from my husband. A really nice kettle for boiling hot water.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah. We wanted to go out for a really fancy dinner, but then I wasn't in the mood for it, so we just drove and got some Vietnamese food, and we spent it in bed watching TV, eating Vietnamese food. I think that's perfect. I didn't watch the Waltons this year because my husband was home, because when I'm alone, I always spend my birthday in bed with takeout food, watching the Waltons. But
of
this
course.
year, we were watching the last season of Walking Dead, so...
Nice. Yeah, we've been kind of watching that one as well. Your last birthday present arrived, so I'm getting ready to send you your little birthday package, including Girl Scout cookies, because you've never had them. That'll be really fun for a Patreon unboxing.
I just know it from as a pop culture reference from movies.
All right, so you like mint and chocolate together, yes? Or no?
Yeah. It's hard for me to say because I'm very weird with sweet things. I like sweet, but not too sweet. So that's all you can go by.
I know.
I'm very open to most things.
Yeah, so I'm going to send her, Americans will know what I'm talking about here. I'm going to send her Thin Mints, and then I'm going to send some, they used to be called Samoas. Now I think they're called Caramel Delights, and they're like chocolate with toasted coconut and caramel. They're nice. And then, what's the other ones I got? Oh, the ones that are chocolate and peanut butter. You'll like those. That's such an American combination.
I love peanut butter.
Yeah. It's good stuff. And then I got some other stuff for you too. And I got you a little treat from the Bahamas. So, you'll see what we send. That'll be fun.
What's your something good?
I want to thank my friends for I just feel like I have the best friends, I feel so lucky. Yeah, just really, really, really lucky. You know who I'm talking about. People listening to this will know. You know who you are. Ooh, we also have a fun announcement about Lady of the Dunes. We'll talk more about that next week. That collaboration that I was fortunate enough to do with Charlie from Crying Lines, who is a delight. And so we've got some more information on that coming out next week. So that'll be a fun thing to talk about.
I want to say thank you to everybody who keeps voting for us with the podcast magazine.
Yes.
Every month they release a Hot 50 chart with the 50 hottest podcasts. You can vote daily once. Everybody has one vote per day. And last month we were on number 17, and this month you already push us to number 13. So let's see if you get us in the top 10. That would be awesome.
That's amazing.
So if you go to the podcast magazine to cast your vote, please vote for us.
All right.
If you enjoyed this episode or any of our other episodes or all of our other episodes, please do us a huge favor. Go to your podcast app and check if you can leave us a rating and or review. iTunes, you can definitely do that there. And is still waiting for 1,000 ratings, reviews on American iTunes.
Yeah, I sure am.
That's her goal. So please do that. It helps us out a lot. If you want to know where to contact us, if you want to see the address of our PO box to send us stuff, if you want to see the link to our Patreon, if you want to see a link to our merch store, please go to our webpage, which is freshhellpodcast.com. There you'll find all of it. If you're not in the Facebook group yet, what are you waiting for?
Come quick, join before we're shut down.
Before we shut down, and also join us before it's next year's birthday, because I want to see more photos of things that remind you of me.
It's such a fun group.
Amazing.
Such a fun group.
Please say hi to all of your pets. We love them. We miss them. We need more photos with. It's always great when new members join the Facebook group and the first thing they do is they send us the photos of their pets.
I love that.
We really love that.
It's so good.
They're the best pets, really. Give them treats. Hug them. Cuddle them. Put them under the blanket. They deserve it. And that's it. That's all I have to say. Oh yeah, please be kind to your fellow human being. Sometimes they also deserve that. So.
Sometimes, every once in a while they do. So just, give them the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Don't let them walk all over you,
no.
But, you're a good judge of character, I guess.
That's right. We trust you. You listen to us, so we feel like you've got this.
Exactly.
You'll manage just fine. And in the meantime, if everything around you is falling apart and you are going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
See you next week.